Okay, topic 1.3 is about comparative advantage and gains from trade. So let's look at this first. Absolute advantage. That's when you can make more of another good or service than your competitor, somebody you're competing against. It could be a person, it could be a business, it could be a country, but it's when you can produce more than the competition or than another producer. So in the example I give here, country A can produce 500 robots, country B can produce 1,000 robots. Well, country B has an absolute advantage because they produce more robots than country A. One way to remember that is absolute means like total or complete. Well, they have total control of production compared to here because they can produce more. Comparative advantage, though, that is when a person, business, or country can produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than another producer. And remember, opportunity cost is what you give up when you make a good or service. So, what you give up of the other product when you make the product that you're going to make. And the way that you calculate it, let's say that you're trying to calculate the opportunity cost for good X. We figure out how much you could have produced at good Y. You divide that by how much you will produce for good X, and that gives you the opportunity cost. Comparative advantage is really what makes trade possible. Because if you have an absolute advantage, you don't need to trade. But if you have a lower opportunity cost of one good, and another country has a lower opportunity cost of another good, you will specialize in making the good that you have the lower opportunity cost in. They will specialize in making the good they have the lower opportunity cost in, and then you will trade with each other. So specialization is what makes trade possible, and trade is what allows economies to grow. So let's look at this. You got country A and you got country B. Country A can make 100 smartphones or 120 units of clothing. Country B can make 90 smartphones or 80 units of clothing. Well, if you look, country A, it has an absolute advantage in both products. So if you go off of absolute advantage, it doesn't need to trade. But if we calculate the opportunity cost, we'll find that it's better for one country to make smartphones and another to make clothing. So let's look at how you figure out opportunity cost. So let's look at country A. You're going to divide clothing by smartphones to find the opportunity cost for smartphones. So we have 120 clothing and we have 100 smartphones. We want to get this 100 down to 1. So we divide both sides by 100 and we find that the opportunity cost for making one smartphone is 1.2 clothing. So to make one smartphone, they could have made 1.2 clothing instead. Then when we look at their opportunity cost for clothing, we divide 100 smartphones by 120 clothing. We want to get this down to 1. And so when we do that, we find that to make one clothing, they are giving up the opportunity to make 0.83 smartphones. Then let's look at country B. We're going to figure out their opportunity cost for smartphones first. And we're going to divide the 80 clothing by the 90 smartphones because we want to solve for smartphones. We want to get this down to 1. And we find that to make one smartphone, they're giving up 0.89 clothing. Then for country B, their opportunity cost for clothing, we divide the 90 smartphones by 80 clothing. And to make one clothing, they could have made 1.13 smartphones instead. So their opportunity cost to make one clothing is 1.13 smartphones. So if we look at this, okay, we want to figure out who has the lower opportunity cost in each. Well, for country B, they have the comparative advantage in making smartphones because they give up less clothing to make one smartphone. They only give up 0.89 clothing. Country A gives up 1.2 because they give up less. They're going to make the smartphone and then they'll trade for the clothing. Then country A has the comparative advantage in clothing because they give up less smartphones, 0.83 compared to 1.13 smartphones to make a clothing. So country A will make clothing, country B will make smartphones, and they're going to trade with each other. And the reason why is because it's cheaper for country A to trade for clothing than it would be for it to make it. So let's look at another example. We have two countries here. We have Mexico and France. Mexico uh, could make either 50 planes or 10 cars. France can make either 20 planes or 40 cars. So we're going to calculate the opportunity cost. Really, the information we're looking at here is the exact same as what we saw previously. The only difference is previously it was in a table, and here it's on a graph. Let's do the same thing with the graph as we did with the table. So we're going to figure out what is the opportunity cost for Mexico to make cars. Put 50 planes on one side, we put 10 cars on the other. We want to get that 10 cars down to 1, so we divide both sides by 10. And we find that in order to make one car, they are giving up the ability to make 5 planes. So they could have made 5 planes, but instead they're going to make one car. And then we do the same thing over here for opportunity cost. We divide 10 cars by 50 planes, and we find that the opportunity cost to make one plane is 0.2 cars. Then we do the same for France. 20 planes equals 40 cars. We want to solve for cars, so we divide both sides by 40. And so we find that the opportunity cost to make one car is 0.5 planes for France. Then we look at what it would be for planes. We divide both sides by 20 to get the planes down to 1. And the opportunity cost to make one plane is they gave up the opportunity to make 2 cars. So then we put that together and we see that France has the comparative advantage in making cars because they give up less planes to make one car. Mexico has the opportunity, I'm sorry, not the opportunity cost, has the comparative advantage in making planes. And then what they would do is Mexico would specialize in making planes, and then France would specialize in making cars, and then they would trade with each other. Okay? So when we look at this, there's two different kinds of problems that you see in macroeconomics. The example we just looked at is an output problem. We look at what we're given two products. We're given the output or the amount of production of those two products. For an input problem, instead of knowing how much they're making, we are given how much time, how many workers, or how much machinery it would take to make a product. So in the previous one, we saw how many planes or how many cars they could make. Well, on this, instead of looking at how many smartphones they can make or how many I just drew a blank on the other thing that we were looking at. But instead we look at it takes 2 hours for country A to make one smartphone and country B can make one smartphone in 3 hours. That would be an input problem. You still solve them the same way. They just appear differently. And so sometimes when students get an input problem, they're so used to output problems because those are the more common that they kind of freak out a little bit. But you do them the same way. All right, specialization, that is when your country or your company focuses on making a small range of products. So in order for trade to happen, two countries have to specialize in different products, and then they have to trade for the product that they do not make. If they both make the same product, they can't trade. So they have to specialize. Specialization is necessary for trade to happen. And then mutually beneficial trade is when both countries gain from trade. And there's several reasons why a country might specialize in the production of a certain good or service. And so those reasons could be what kind of resources that they have access to. What is the skill level or the education level of their workforce? And then absolute advantage and comparative advantage can also impact what a country specializes in. So for trade allows for countries to make more stuff, to have higher output, to make more of a product, because they can focus on one or a small groups of products. And by doing that, they become very efficient at making those products and they produce more. And then by trading for what they don't produce, that allows for increased consumption. So trade allows all countries involved in the trade to consume more and therefore to make more money. And so mutually beneficial trade is when two countries exchange goods or services and it allows them to in such a way that allows them both to benefit and it makes them both better off. And so in our first example, country A makes smartphones and then whatever they don't use, they will trade the surplus, they'll trade the extra to other countries, and then that will make them more money in the long run. So, terms of trade, the way that you figure out the terms of trade is you use this formula right here. You divide the price of the export by the price of the imports, you multiply that by 100, and that will give you the most advantageous terms of trade.